On May 12, 1985, a couple became concerned when they noticed their neighbors hadn't left their house for several days, and newspapers were accumulating at the door. Suspecting something was wrong, the husband decided to investigate. As he approached the window, he heard a baby crying and promptly called the authorities. When the officers arrived and entered the home, they were met with a horrifying scene. This is the heartbreaking case of the Eastburn family. The Eastburn family, a military household, resided in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Gary Eastburn was a captain in the U.S. Air Force. He met Catherine in the 1970s. Their young love blossomed into a lifelong commitment. For the Kansas girl, it seemed like love at first sight. After dating for 5 years, they married. They had 3 beautiful daughters, Cara, Erin, and Jana. Katie was a stay-at-home mom as they moved frequently due to Gary's military career. In 1983, they were stationed at Pope Air Force Base, where Gary served as the air traffic control chief. In May 1985, Gary was training at a squadron's officer school in Montgomery, Alabama, while his family stayed in Fayetteville. Life was as routine as it gets for a military family until they planned a move to England for Gary's job. Unfortunately, their hoped-for peace was shattered by a man in a horrific way. In addition to the Eastburn family, this story also involves a man named Timothy Bailey Hennis. Timothy Hennis, a Minnesota native, was navigating life at his own pace. Publicly, he appeared as an average man, a blonde-haired but easily noticeable due to his towering height of over 6 feet. He grew up in Rochester, Minnesota, and graduated from Mayo High School in 1976. Hennis worked in Rochester until he enlisted in the United States Army in 1980, marking a significant change in his life. He went on to marry Angela, who gave birth to their daughter Christina in 1985. Around the same time, Hennis was employed as a parachute rigger at Fort Bragg. The paths of the Eastburns and Timothy crossed on Tuesday, May 7, 1985, when he responded to an ad Catherine placed in the local paper to rehome their family dog. Due to their upcoming move to London, they couldn't bring the dog and were hopeful to find her a loving new home. Coincidentally, Hennis's family was seeking a dog, as their current one did not get along with their newborn. That Tuesday, Catherine invited Timothy over, and after some conversation, he took the dog to see if she would adapt to his family. By this time, Gary had been at the military base for a few weeks. Over the years, they had developed a habit of calling each other every Saturday morning since Gary spent most of his time on base. However, on Saturday, May 11th, Catherine didn't answer Gary's calls. Sensing something was wrong, Gary contacted the Fayetteville Police Department. Officers responded and visited the Eastburn home, but no one answered the door, and the house lights were off. Before leaving, they left a note for Catherine to contact her husband. On Sunday, May the 12th, the Eastburns' neighbors, Sergeant Bob Seafelt and his wife, noticed newspapers piling up outside. Reflecting on the past few days, they realized Catherine's car hadn't been moved. Bob decided to investigate, and although no one answered his knocking or the doorbell, he thought he heard a baby crying inside. So he went home and called the Eastburns' babysitter, who arrived quickly. She looked through the window and saw Jana lying in her crib with her arms outstretched. She tried to enter the house to get the baby, but Bob convinced her to wait for the police. The first officer to arrive opened a window in the baby's room and handed Jana to Bob. He asked the neighbor to wait outside while he searched the house, as there was a strong odor he needed to investigate. Inside, the officer found the lifeless bodies of Catherine and Erin and called for backup. Further inspection revealed Cara's remains as well. While the police secured the scene, Jana was cared for at the Seafelt home. The girl was sobbing and covered in feces. Doctors who treated her determined she was severely dehydrated and warned that her condition was critical. Without immediate help, she faced imminent death. Catherine, age 31, was discovered without pants or underwear, wearing a torn blouse and bra, with multiple stab wounds and signs of assault. 3-year-old Erin was found in her parents' bedroom, also bearing stab wounds and blunt force injuries to her chest and back. 5-year-old Cara was located in her bed, appearing to hide under a blanket with various chest injuries. All 3 victims had their throats cut. Police established that 2-year-old Jana had been alone in her crib for 3 days until neighbors found her. When asked later about that night, survivor Jana told a child psychologist she hid because bad men were coming, possibly instructed by her sisters to remain hidden, which might have saved her from harm. Investigators also determined the perpetrator spared Jana's life, as he didn't think there was a risk that she would recognize him. Forensic experts collected samples from both the crime scene and the victims' bodies. Evidence included hair strands, fingerprints, blood traces, and seminal fluid, with the latter found during Catherine's examination. Despite the severity of injuries, little blood was found at the scene, yet a luminol test indicated blood had been wiped on walls and in the bathroom. Detective Jack Watts personally contacted Gary to inform him about the tragic events involving his family. When the phone rang in Gary's bedroom, he hoped to hear Catherine's voice, but upon learning it was a detective, he braced for devastating news. The officer instructed Gary to return immediately without disclosing details over the phone. That evening, Gary boarded a plane back to Fayetteville, unsure of what awaited him. Upon arrival, he faced the heartbreaking reality that his wife and 2 daughters had been murdered. However, he found solace in knowing Jana had survived. Gary cooperated fully with detectives despite his deep depression. Initially a suspect, his alibi of being in Alabama weeks prior to the crime quickly cleared him of suspicion. Gary's account highlighted 2 key details that piqued investigators' interest: the advertisement seeking a new home for their dog and Catherine's visit from a stranger on the 7th. According to Gary, Catherine had mentioned in a letter that a compassionate man had taken their dog in hopes of integrating it into his family. After obtaining Gary's statement, investigators escorted him home to ascertain any missing items. Gary reported that Catherine's bank card and a piece of paper containing her password were absent. Additionally, an envelope containing around $300 was nowhere to be found. The Eastburn's babysitter also informed the police that Catherine had expressed concerns about being stalked. The family had endured harassing phone calls for months, with the caller occasionally making explicit references to Catherine. A few days before the tragedy, the babysitter answered a call from a woman named Angela who was interested in seeing the dog. The babysitter recorded Angela's details for Catherine to return the call. However, the note containing Angela's information was not discovered during the house search. During the investigation into the perpetrator's identity, 20-year-old Patrick Cohn approached investigators with potentially valuable information. Patrick recounted seeing a man leaving the Eastburn residence on the evening of Friday, May 10th, the day authorities believed the tragedy occurred. Patrick recalled that around 3:30 a.m. that Friday, while driving home, he observed a white Chevrolet Chevette parked in the driveway and witnessed a man exiting the house. Patrick provided a detailed description of the man, noting he was white, tall, with blonde hair, a broad nose, and a mustache. He mentioned the man wore a black jacket and jeans and was carrying a trash bag at the time. Investigators requested the young man's assistance in creating a composite sketch of the suspect. Subsequently, authorities disseminated the sketch and description of the individual. Additionally, a plea was issued for the man who had responded to Catherine's dog ad to come forward to the police. This appeal had the intended consequence. Timothy Hennis was at home with his wife watching the news when he saw the advertisement. He was stunned to realize that he was the person who had responded to the ad and bore a striking resemblance to the sketch. Without hesitation, Timothy immediately left his residence with his wife and daughter, driving his white Chevrolet to the police station, where he volunteered to assist in any way possible. Timothy cooperated with investigators for several hours without legal representation. When describing his interaction with Catherine on the 7th, he recounted parking his car at his residence around 9 p.m. and walking up the driveway with a leash in hand. According to his account, he knocked on the door and was greeted by a woman who invited him inside. Timothy continued, stating that Catherine informed him she had just put her 3 young daughters to bed and proceeded to introduce him to the dog. He mentioned liking the dog, but expressed interest in seeing how she would interact with his Spitz. Consequently, he agreed to take the dog home to his wife and daughter and assured Catherine they would stay in touch. Investigators established that the crimes occurred between Thursday evening and early Friday morning. It was on the 10th that newspapers began accumulating on the porch of the residence. Additionally, neighbors had spotted Catherine earlier on the 9th. Based on this evidence, law enforcement questioned Timothy about his activities that evening. He stated that he had driven his wife and daughter to a relative's house and then returned home. Authorities requested Timothy to provide samples of hair, blood, and seminal fluid, but forensic analysis did not link him to the crime. Simultaneously, police prepared a lineup for Patrick, who had identified Timothy from a photograph taken during a previous arrest due to bounced checks. When presented with 6 images, Patrick promptly identified Timothy. Timothy was released after several hours of questioning, and he drove back home. Police knew they had found their main suspect, and from that point on, they focused their investigation squarely on him, initiating interviews with his neighbors. Residents reported seeing him spending 5 hours near his home, burning items in a barrel, which drew attention as it was an unusual activity for him. Additionally, the dry cleaners confirmed that he had brought in his jacket for cleaning the day after the crime occurred. Another significant detail came from the landlord of Timothy's residence, who mentioned that Timothy promptly settled a $350 rent debt shortly after the incident. After the interrogations, Timothy and Angela believed their interactions with the police were over, but they were mistaken. Detectives arrived at their residence with an arrest warrant, charging the sergeant with sexual assault and first-degree murder of Catherine and her 2 daughters. In the course of the investigation, a woman came forward as a witness, providing crucial information linking the defendant to the use of the victim's debit card. Investigators determined that the stolen card was used at 10:54 p.m. on May 10th and 8:56 a.m. on May 11th. According to the witness, she had used the ATM shortly before seeing a tall blonde man in camouflage pants drive away in a light-colored vehicle. The timing described by the witness aligned with the recorded banking transactions. Detectives connected the $300 cash withdrawal to the previously mentioned overdue rent payment. Timothy retained a prestigious legal team, represented by Gerald Beaver and Billy Richardson, renowned as top attorneys in North Carolina. Prosecutors proposed a plea bargain to Timothy's defense, offering 2 counts of second-degree murder with a probable sentence of 2 consecutive life terms. He rejected the offer, maintaining his innocence and refusing to plead guilty. The defense strategy aimed to undermine the credibility of a key prosecution witness. They replicated the moment Patrick identified a man as Timothy by revisiting the Eastburn house under similar lighting and weather conditions. However, the witness did not spot the suspect during the reenactment. An unexpected development arose during the site inspection when a neighbor approached them, revealing he had observed a van parked outside the family's residence on the night of the crime. He recalled seeing a white man with short hair, accompanied by companions. A subsequent reenactment with Patrick suggested he might have misidentified the suspect. The defense attorneys then focused on discrediting a prosecution witness, the woman who had initially claimed to have seen the suspect at the ATM. During cross-examination, she recanted her statement, asserting that she had not witnessed anyone there that day. Timothy's first trial commenced in 1986, approximately a year after the triple homicides. The prosecution's case relied on circumstantial evidence, lacking any physical proof linking the sergeant to the murders. One theory proposed was that Timothy's advances towards Catherine were rebuffed, leading to a sexual assault followed by his decision to eliminate her and her daughters to prevent identification. During the trial, the prosecutor portrayed the events at the Eastburn residence as sheer madness, describing it as one of the most tragic incidents in the nation's history up to that time. His argument was accompanied by a presentation of numerous disturbing crime scene photographs. Patrick served as the key prosecution witness before the jury, positively identifying the defendant as the man he had observed leaving the Eastburn home in the early hours of May 10, 1985. On July 4, 1986, following 10 hours of deliberation, a jury convicted Timothy on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree sexual assault. Just 4 days later, on July 8th, he received a death sentence and was transferred to death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. However, this marked only the conclusion of the initial chapter in a protracted legal saga, as Timothy's defense remained steadfast in their quest to establish his innocence. By 1988, his legal team appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court, citing investigation inconsistencies, false testimony, evidence suppression, and improper use of graphic materials that had swayed the jury's verdict. Consequently, the justices ruled in Timothy's favor, overturning the previous trial and initiating a new one that commenced in April 1989. During this retrial, the defense concentrated on discrediting Patrick's testimony, arguing its inaccuracies from the first trial. New witnesses emerged in Timothy's support, including a newspaper delivery woman who testified that at 1:45 a.m. on the day of the incident, she had spotted a long-haired man driving a light-colored van near the Eastburn's residence. In a similar vein, the defense presented another witness, a tall teenager with blonde hair named John Raupour, who testified that he frequently walked near the Eastburn residence late at night when he couldn't sleep. He admitted passing by around 3 a.m. on May 10, 1985, mentioning he often wore a cap and had a black jacket resembling the one described by the witness. This testimony allowed the defense to argue that Patrick might have mistaken John for the suspect that critical day, planting reasonable doubt about Timothy's culpability in the minds of the jury. The defense also highlighted that shoe prints discovered outside the Eastburn house were 3 sizes smaller than those of the defendant. Additionally, it was noted that a blood sample from a towel did not match Timothy's blood profile. Further bolstering their case was an anonymous letter processed by the post office on the same day as the trial. The letter expressed remorse to Timothy and confessed to the crimes committed. The trial spanned 3 weeks, and after 2 days of deliberation, the jury unanimously acquitted Timothy of all charges. Timothy left the courtroom as a free man. He later re-enlisted in the military and in 1998 relocated with his wife and children to Fort Lewis, Washington. After the initial trial, Gary moved on with his life and focused on caring for Jana. Despite scrapping plans to relocate to London following the death of his wife and 2 children, he concluded in 1988 that a change of surroundings was necessary and decided to relocate to England. While there, he was informed of the need to return to the United States for a retrial. Once the trial concluded, he returned to England where he met and married an Air Force nurse. In 1998, Gary returned to the US, settling in a town 20 kilometers from Fort Lewis. In 2005, the unresolved Eastburn family murder case was discussed at a seminar on advanced criminal intelligence techniques for detectives. It was there that Larry Trotter, a homicide detective from Cumberland County, learned about seminal fluid samples collected during the initial investigation, which had previously not yielded any matches. Aware of advancements in DNA analysis, Larry arranged for further testing of these samples stored by the sheriff's office. A year later, the results from the State Bureau of Investigation lab were returned. With the test results came the long-awaited revelation. The DNA profile matched that of Timothy Bailey Hennis. Adding to the clarity, the forensic scientist affirmed that the sample was 1 billion times more likely to belong to Timothy than to any other resident of North Carolina. Larry Trotter promptly shared this breakthrough with the district attorney, who then contacted Gary Eastburn. Confident that they had the right suspect, and now armed with concrete evidence, the DA transferred the case to Fort Bragg's legal team, who presented it to the base commander general. In response, the commander ordered Timothy to be activated for duty to face 3 charges of murder and a court-martial. On September 26, 2006, accompanied by a military lawyer, a Fort Bragg CID officer, and 2 police officers, Timothy was formally served a letter directing him to report to base within 30 days. Despite the pending charges, he reported for duty and began working part-time in an office role, receiving regular pay and benefits. In August 2007, the commander of the 16th Airborne Corps ordered Timothy Hennis to stand trial in a court-martial on 3 counts of premeditated murder. By December 2007, Hennis filed an appeal arguing that the Army lacked jurisdiction, but his petition was denied in April 2008. In May 2008, Hennis further appealed the court-martial decision to the United States Army Court of Criminal Appeals, only to have it dismissed the following month. Continuing his efforts in September 2008, Hennis appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, which also dismissed his appeal. Undeterred, Hennis pursued another appeal in December 2009 at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, but once again it was rejected in March 2010. Timothy's court-martial commenced on March 17, 2010, marking 21 years since his previous acquittal. Colonel Patrick Parrish presided over the proceedings, where prosecutors emphasized the new DNA evidence as the pivotal difference from previous trials. The prosecution presented crime scene photographs and a series of family photos provided by Gary, depicting his smiling wife and daughters. Following a 3-week trial, Timothy Hennis was convicted of premeditated murder on April 15, 2010, and sentenced to death. He was dishonorably discharged from the army and confined to Fort Leavenworth's disciplinary barracks in Kansas. He remains the only individual to undergo 3 trials from not guilty to guilty verdicts. Presidential approval is required for military executions, a rarity since the 1960s, making his actual execution unlikely. In February 2020, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces denied his appeal. Gary Eastburn commented on the sentence, expressing doubt about Timothy's imminent execution, citing the last army execution in 1961. In a 2010 interview with the Seattle Times, Gary remarked, "I'm perfectly content if he spends the rest of his life in prison. But if they do execute him, it's no more than he deserves." It is sad and unfortunate what all the victims faced against this monster. As we reflect on this heart-wrenching tale, our thoughts are with the victims whose lives were tragically cut short and the loved ones they left behind. If you found this video compelling, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and check out our other videos. Thank you for watching.